stand up. I need your ID. We've had a complaint and you don't look like you belong in this area. I ordered coffee and I am seated. What is the lawful basis and specific crime you are investigating?
He thought he was about to intimidate another suspicious black man out of a waterfront cafe. Instead, he put his hands on a decorated Navy admiral, triggered a federal civil rights investigation, and started a chain of events that would end with a prison sentence. It began mid-conflict, the way these stories always seem to start, with a uniform standing over a seated customer and a demand that sounded more like an order than a question. Stand up. I need your ID. The patio at Seaside Brew Cafe in Norfolk went quiet in layers, conversations thinning out as people sensed something tightening in the air. The man being addressed didn't stand. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked up and asked, "What is the legal reason you need my identification, officer?" Officer Daniel Crow shifted his weight, one hand hovering near his duty belt, body camera blinking red. "We received a complaint," he said. "You match the description." "Description of what crime?" the man asked calmly. Crow didn't answer that directly. Instead, he leaned closer, crowding the small metal table. "Last time, stand up and come outside with me." The man closed the leather folder in front of him and kept his hands visible on the tabletop. "Am I being detained?" he asked. The officer's jaw tightened. "Don't play games. I said stand up." What nobody at the surrounding tables knew yet was that the man sitting there was Admiral Terrence Holloway, a four-star Navy admiral assigned to oversee Atlantic Fleet logistics. A career officer with more than 3 decades of service, multiple combat deployments, and a resume that required briefings at the Pentagon. But that morning he wore no uniform, no insignia, no visible markers of rank. Just a windbreaker, pressed slacks, and the posture of someone used to staying composed under pressure. Rewind to how it started. It was a clear weekday morning near Naval Station Norfolk, the harbor visible just beyond the row of parked cars. Seaside Brew Cafe stayed busy with sailors, contractors, retirees, and students tapping at laptops. Security cameras covered the entrance, the counter, and the outdoor seating area. The manager, Elena Ramirez, ran a tight operation. She believed in clean books and clean records, the kind of place where problems were solved quickly and documented thoroughly. Admiral Holloway had come in alone, ordered black coffee, nodded politely to staff, and taken a seat outside to review printed briefing notes. He wasn't loud. He wasn't disruptive. He was reading. Officer Crow entered 15 minutes later with no urgency in his stride. Dispatch logs would later show there was no active emergency call tied to the cafe at that time. Crow didn't speak to the barista. He didn't ask the manager whether assistance was needed. He scanned the patio, eyes moving table to table, and then locked onto Holloway. Later, investigators would replay that entrance frame by frame. Crow approached with the posture of someone who had already decided there was a problem. He stopped too close to the table, angled his shoulders to block easy exit, opened with a command, not a question. "Stand up. I need your ID." Holloway responded the same way he had trained junior officers to respond in tense negotiations: slow, controlled, procedural. "What's the legal basis?" Crow's explanation shifted almost immediately. First it was a complaint about a suspicious person. Then it became loitering. When that didn't hold, because Holloway gestured calmly toward his coffee and receipt, it pivoted to possible trespassing. "The business didn't ask me to leave," Holloway replied. "Have they reported a crime?" Crow's tone sharpened. "You're being uncooperative." "Asking the reason for detention isn't uncooperative," Holloway said evenly. "Am I free to go?" That's when the dynamic changed. Crow didn't like that the man in front of him wasn't flustered. He didn't like that the questions were precise. He didn't like that the conversation was being steered back to legal footing. Elena Ramirez noticed the shift and stepped outside. "Officer, is there an issue?" she asked. "Ma'am, step back," Crow said without looking at her. "We didn't call the police," she replied. "He's a paying customer." Crow waved a hand dismissively. "There was a complaint." "From who?" Holloway asked. No clear answer came. Customers began paying closer attention. One person lowered their phone just enough to activate the camera discreetly. Another angled their chair to get a better view. Crow tried another tactic. "You don't look like you belong in this area," he said, the words hanging heavier than their syllables. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't framed as an insult. But everyone within earshot understood what it implied. Holloway didn't react emotionally. He didn't reveal his rank. He didn't correct the assumption. He stayed seated, hands still visible. "Officer, if I'm being detained, please state the crime. If I'm not, I'll continue my morning." Crow reached down and grabbed Holloway's wrist. The scrape of chair legs echoed as several patrons instinctively stood. Holloway did not pull away. He did not raise his voice. "On what authority are you placing hands on me?" he asked. Crow tightened his grip, attempting to pull him up from the chair. "Stop resisting." "I am not resisting," Holloway replied calmly, keeping his other hand flat on the table. 3 cameras captured that moment from 3 different angles. Crow's body cam recording his own shifting justifications, the cafe's security system documenting the full scene, and at least one customer's phone preserving an independent view. Sergeant Melissa Grant's cruiser pulled into the lot minutes later, drawn by escalating radio traffic that described a non-compliant subject. But what she walked into was not a chaotic disturbance. It was a seated man asking measured legal questions, and an officer visibly frustrated that compliance hadn't come instantly. Crow stepped back as Grant approached, offering a clipped explanation about refusal to identify. Holloway looked up at the sergeant. "Ma'am, I have asked repeatedly for the legal basis of detention," he said calmly. "I have not been given one." Grant glanced at the surrounding phones, at the manager standing firm beside the door, at the quiet tension in the patio. The morning sun reflected off the harbor behind them, peaceful and ordinary, a stark contrast to the scene unfolding. What Officer Daniel Crow did not yet realize, what none of the bystanders fully understood, was that this wasn't going to fade into paperwork and routine dismissal. Because the man he had chosen to single out was not only deeply familiar with authority, but deeply disciplined in how to challenge it. And before the day ended, every second of this encounter would be documented, preserved, and positioned in a way that would transform a routine patrol stop into a federal case. The officer thought the tension had peaked on that patio. He didn't realize it was only the beginning of the documentation phase that would dismantle his version of events piece by piece. When Sergeant Melissa Grant stepped between Officer Daniel Crow and Admiral Terrence Holloway, the air shifted, not because the legality of the stop suddenly improved, but because there was now another set of eyes evaluating the scene. Crow spoke first, fast and defensive, describing Holloway as evasive and refusing lawful commands. Grant turned to Holloway. "Sir, what's going on?" she asked, tone measured. Holloway remained seated, posture upright, hands open on the table. "I was ordered to provide identification without being told what crime I'm suspected of committing," he said calmly. "When I asked whether I was being detained and on what basis, the officer escalated and placed hands on me." Grant glanced at Crow. "What was the complaint?" she asked. Crow hesitated half a second too long. "Suspicious person. Loitering." Elena Ramirez stepped forward again. "Sergeant, we didn't call," she said firmly. "He bought coffee. He's been reading quietly. There's no issue." Grant absorbed that. Cameras were visible above the patio. 2 customers were clearly recording now. Holloway spoke again, still calm. "If I am being detained, please articulate the specific statute. If not, I'd like to continue my morning." Grant tried the standard off-ramp. "Sir, if you just show ID, we can clear this up and everyone goes on their way." Holloway didn't argue. He didn't posture. He didn't reveal who he was. "Respectfully, Sergeant, I comply with lawful orders. I'm asking for the legal basis." The exchange wasn't loud. That's what made it powerful. Crow shifted tactics again. He refused multiple commands, he insisted. "He's escalating." The security footage would later show the opposite. Crow crowding the table, Crow raising his voice, Crow initiating physical contact. Grant seemed to sense the imbalance. She looked at the manager. "You're saying he's welcome here?" "Yes," Elena replied without hesitation. "He's not trespassing." That closed one avenue of justification. Crow's jaw tightened. Grant made a decision designed to de-escalate quickly and limit exposure. "Disengage," she told Crow quietly. It wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. Crow stepped back, irritation obvious in his posture. Holloway remained seated. "May I have both of your names and badge numbers?" he asked. Crow recited his with visible annoyance. Grant followed. "Is your body camera recording?" Holloway asked. "Yes," Crow replied sharply. Holloway nodded once. "Thank you." There was no speech. No reveal. No dramatic moment of identity. Crow and Grant returned to their cruiser. The patrol car pulled away. The patio slowly exhaled. Conversations resumed in fragments. Holloway remained seated for a full 30 seconds after the cruiser left. Then he turned to Elena. "Ma'am, I'm going to request that you preserve all security footage from 9 a.m. until now," he said evenly. "Please make multiple copies. Do not overwrite it." Elena didn't ask why. She nodded. "We back up daily," she said. "I'll secure it." Holloway finished his coffee. Then he opened his leather folder again, not to read, but to write. He documented the timeline minute by minute while it was still fresh. Exact phrases used. The shifting reasons: suspicious person, loitering, trespass, refusal. The moment hands were placed on him. The presence of witnesses. The body camera confirmation. He wrote it clinically, without emotion. Years of operational planning had trained him in after-action reporting. Stick to sequence. Stick to fact. Avoid adjectives. By noon, formal preservation requests were in motion. Not through media, not through social channels. Through official channels. Requests for body camera footage, dispatch audio, CED logs, radio, transmissions, and all report drafts associated with the incident. Each request timestamped. Each routed in a way that created its own record. That same afternoon, Crow submitted his incident report. It described Holloway as agitated and refusing repeated lawful orders. It claimed a complaint about a man matching suspicious activity indicators. It referenced safety concerns and noncompliance. On paper, it looked clean. But paperwork has a weakness: timestamps. When internal review pulled Crow's body camera, the footage didn't match the narrative tone. It showed Holloway calm, seated, hands visible. It showed repeated legal questions. It showed Crow unable to articulate a specific statute. Then came the cafe footage. Wide angle. Unbroken. It showed Crow initiating proximity. Crow raising intensity. Crow grabbing Holloway's wrist. There was no aggression from the seated man. No disturbance. No escalation initiated by him. That's when something else surfaced. Metadata logs showed the incident report had been accessed and edited twice after the body cam upload was completed. The revised version contained more refined legal phrasing. Language like reasonable suspicion appeared where earlier drafts had said suspicious. Sentences were tightened. Justifications sharpened. The edits weren't obvious to the casual reader. But to an investigator comparing versions side by side, they were glaring. Meanwhile, Admiral Terrence Holloway still had not publicly identified himself in connection with the stop. His complaint was filed formally, routed beyond local review. It wasn't about embarrassment. It wasn't about personal offense. It was structured as a civil rights violation review supported by video evidence and report inconsistencies. Federal reviewers began pulling prior stops conducted by Officer Crow. Patterns emerged quickly. Multiple stops categorized under suspicious person. Repeated phrasing in reports. Disproportionate targeting in predominantly black neighborhoods. Similar descriptions of refusal that, when cross-referenced with available footage, showed citizens calmly asking questions. It stopped being about one patio in Norfolk. It started looking systemic. Crow was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The department issued a short statement about standard review procedures. But internally, concern was growing. Because if one report was altered post-video review, how many others had been adjusted? Investigators widened the scope. They examined upload timestamps, audit logs, and access histories. They interviewed prior complainants whose cases had gone nowhere. Some had pleaded out minor charges years earlier rather than fight. Now their stops were being re-examined under a different lens. And then the revelation that changed everything surfaced during a federal interview. Crow had acknowledged reviewing body camera footage before finalizing certain reports to ensure accuracy. Accuracy is one thing. Aligning narrative to footage is another. The distinction matters legally. By the time subpoenas were issued for expanded records, this was no longer an internal disciplinary review. It was a federal civil rights investigation. Admiral Holloway remained silent publicly. He continued reporting to duty, continued overseeing fleet logistics. No press conference, no statement, because the strategy was not emotional outrage. It was procedural inevitability. Evidence preserved. Paper trail secured. Patterns identified. Officer Daniel Crow still believed, at least initially, that this would resolve quietly. Officers resign. Departments settle. Stories fade. But this time, there were 3 independent video angles. There were timestamp discrepancies. There were prior stops. And there was a complainant who understood chain of custody and documentation better than most attorneys. What began as a command to stand up was now a widening inquiry into civil rights violations, falsified reporting, and potential evidence tampering. And the deeper investigators looked, the more they found that this wasn't about a single morning. It was about how many mornings like it had happened before, without someone disciplined enough to preserve the proof. By the time the case reached federal court, it was no longer framed as a heated encounter outside a waterfront cafe. It was presented as a pattern, a paper trail, and a deliberate abuse of power that had survived for years because no one had ever stacked the evidence this cleanly. Officer Daniel Crow sat at the defense table in a dark suit instead of a uniform, posture stiff, expression tight, while prosecutors methodically built a timeline that began with "Stand up, I need your ID," and expanded into something far larger than one morning in Norfolk. The courtroom was quiet when the first video played. Body camera footage filled the screen. Jurors watched Crow approach Admiral Terrence Holloway without speaking to staff, without referencing a specific call, without articulating a crime. They heard Holloway's voice, calm, measured, consistent, asking, "Am I being detained? And what is the legal basis?" They heard Crow's explanations shift from suspicious person to loitering to refusal. Then prosecutors overlaid the cafe's security footage. Wide angle, uninterrupted. It showed Holloway seated the entire time, hands visible, no aggressive movement. It showed Crow stepping into his space. It showed the moment Crow grabbed his wrist. No resistance, no threat, just escalation. The prosecution paused the video on that frame. "This," the federal attorney said evenly, "is not officer safety. This is control without cause." But the case didn't stop at that clip. It moved into documentation. Jurors were shown side-by-side comparisons of Crow's initial report draft and the revised version filed after body camera upload. The differences were subtle in wording but powerful in implication. Early phrasing described suspicious presence. Later edits inserted reasonable suspicion based on complaint. The original lacked reference to perceived threat. The final version included non-compliant behavior. Metadata logs were displayed showing report access times. Edits made after video review. An internal affairs digital forensics specialist testified about audit trails. Reports were modified, she said plainly, after the officer had opportunity to review footage. The defense argued that reviewing video improves accuracy. The prosecution countered that accuracy does not explain narrative shifts that justify conduct not originally articulated. Then came the pattern evidence. Investigators had pulled prior stops conducted by Crow over a 4-year period. Similar language appeared repeatedly: suspicious person, failure to identify, escalating behavior. In multiple cases, available footage contradicted written descriptions. Some of those prior stops had led to minor charges: obstruction, failure to comply. Charges that defendants had accepted through plea deals rather than contest in court. Now those individuals testified. One man described being stopped while waiting for a rideshare. A woman recounted being questioned while sitting in her own parked car. Their experiences echoed the same structure seen in Holloway's case: demand first, justification later. The prosecution wasn't painting Crow as someone who made a single mistake. They were establishing willful repetition. When Admiral Terrence Holloway finally took the stand, there was no theatrics. He introduced himself simply: Terrence Holloway, Admiral, United States Navy. A ripple moved through the courtroom. It was the first time his rank had been formally stated in proceedings. But he made something clear immediately. "This is not about my position," he said. "If anything, my position insulated me. The concern is what happens to citizens who lack that insulation." He described the encounter factually: the shifting explanations, the physical contact, the refusal to articulate cause. He emphasized documentation. "Authority must be accountable to law," he said evenly. The defense attempted to argue misinterpretation, stress response, officer discretion. They suggested the situation was tense and fast-moving. Prosecutors replayed the footage again, showing just how unhurried it actually was. Calm voice, seated posture, no crowding until Crow initiated it. In closing arguments, the federal prosecutor distilled the case into 2 core charges: deprivation of civil rights under color of law, and falsification of official records. This case, she said, is about an officer who believed his authority could substitute for legal cause, and when video contradicted him, he adjusted the paperwork. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days. The verdict was read without flourish. Guilty on civil rights violation. Guilty on falsification of records. Guilty on evidence tampering enhancements tied to altered reporting. Crow showed little visible reaction, but his shoulders dropped slightly as the final count was read. Sentencing took place weeks later. The judge's remarks were measured but firm. Public trust, he said, depends on the integrity of those empowered to enforce the law. When that power is abused repeatedly and documented dishonestly, the damage extends beyond one encounter. The court noted the pattern evidence, the metadata findings, and the impact on prior cases. Several convictions tied to Crow's past stops had already been vacated. Others were under review. This was not a momentary lapse, the judge continued. It was sustained conduct. Officer Daniel Crow was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. The sentence drew national attention because it was rare. Not a resignation. Not a quiet settlement. Not a departmental transfer. Prison time. Civil rights convictions carry weight precisely because they signal that authority does not grant immunity. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered. Cameras flashed. Admiral Holloway did not hold a press conference. He issued a brief written statement. The rule of law protects everyone, or it protects no one. He returned to duty, continued overseeing fleet operations, continued attending briefings and signing off on logistics plans that affected thousands of service members. There was no victory tour, no televised interviews, because the objective had never been spectacle. It had been accountability. In the months that followed, the Norfolk Police Department implemented mandatory report audit systems tied to body camera upload timestamps. Independent review boards were strengthened. Several supervisors faced internal discipline for failure to detect report discrepancies earlier. Community trust forums were held, tense but necessary. And perhaps most significantly, citizens whose prior cases had been tainted by Crow's reporting saw their records cleared. Some received formal apologies. Some received settlements. The broader impact rippled outward. Law enforcement training seminars cited the case as an example of how documentation integrity intersects with constitutional law. Prosecutors nationwide referenced it in civil rights compliance discussions. It became a case study not because a Navy admiral was involved, but because the evidence chain had been preserved so precisely that denial became impossible. And that is what ultimately reshaped the narrative. The story was never about rank confronting bias. It was about what happens when power meets disciplined documentation. Officer Crow believed he was managing a routine stop. Instead, he triggered a federal examination of his own conduct. The same cameras he wore to Project Authority became the record that dismantled it. Authority appears absolute when unchallenged. It weakens when questioned. It collapses when recorded, preserved, and tested against the law. And in a cafe by the harbor on an ordinary morning, a demand for identification set that entire collapse in motion.